Big-mouthed Al Jennings, gross incompetence. Clouds of powder smoke filled the cabinet saloon as Temple Houston stood calmly, firing one careful shot after another. When the shooting stopped, Ed Jennings lay dead on the saloon floor, and his brother John was running for his life, hit in the arm and body. The imperturbable Houston was untouched. The Jennings brother, Al, a lawyer, took umbrage at the death of one brother and the wounding of another, and swore bloody vengeance against Houston. Like Elmer McCurdy, whose story we'll get to hear later, Al Jennings was a considerable embarrassment to the outlaw profession, and like Elmer, he embarked on another career and was infinitely more successful than he had been as a bandit. The difference was that, unlike Elmer, Al didn't have to get himself killed to change careers. Al was a braggart, but then a lot of criminals are. What really characterized him as incompetent was his persistent blundering. Al was inept to an unusual extent, even in a line of work in which intelligence was not a common virtue. By 1892, his family had moved west from Virginia and settled at the town of El Reno in Canadian County, Oklahoma. His father became a judge in the local court, and Al practiced law in the area with his brothers John and Ed. Territory lawyers tended to be tough, aggressive, and the Jennings boys fit right in. It was their misfortune, however, to meet Temple Houston, an even tougher lawyer. Houston was the son of Sam Houston, the father of Texas, and he had been both a district attorney and a state senator down in Brazoria County, a wild panhandle judicial district. Houston was the epitome of the successful frontier lawyer, the Prince Albert coat, ornate vest, and of course, Colt revolver. Then he moved north to Woodward in Oklahoma Territory, and it was there that he locked horns with the Jennings boys. During a hard-fought case, Temple Houston referred to Brother Ed as grossly ignorant of the law, which he may well have been. Ed called Houston a liar and started for him. Both men reached for their guns, but others prevented any bloodletting there and then. But after court adjourned, Ed and John adjourned to the cabinet saloon where they ran into Houston and ex-lawman Jack Love. Al later claimed that Ed was ambushed. However, that reported the fight Several newspapers reported that the fight was no more than a common brawl in which the Jennings brothers placed second. The quarrel was renewed. Very few words passed before all drew their pistols, including Houston's friend Love. All engaged in a running and dodging fight except Houston. The huge man stood straight up and emptied his revolver without twitching a muscle. Neither Love nor Houston were wounded, although several bullets passed through their clothes and hats. Al said dramatically that he was summoned to the saloon, where he knelt beside his brother's corpse and swore to kill the man who had murdered his own flesh and blood. Love and Houston were duly tried and acquitted after eyewitnesses said Ed Jennings went for his gun first. Al pondered killing Houston, but continued to do nothing about it. Instead, he wired another brother, Frank, in Denver, and the two ventured into outlawry. They collected some helpers, Morris and Pat O'Malley, and somewhere along the way were joined by perennial bad man Little Dick West, alumnus of the Doolin gang. They also recruited Dan Clifton, better known by his outlaw handle of Dynamite Dick, a one-time Dalton and Doolin follower. Early in June 1897, the new gang held up a store in Violet Springs, one of the infamous Pottawatomie County saloon towns. They then went on to stick up another country store, robbed a party of freighters on the road, and capped their spree by robbing another saloon and all the patrons. Carrying a sack full of money and some stolen whiskey, the little band headed for the woods to relax and enjoy both their whiskey and their success. Al and Dynamite Dick held up a post office near Claremore that brought federal officers looking for them. In his autobiography, beating back, Owl said this early raid was only to test out something called a set screw, a contraption, he said, that was designed to pop loose locks from safes. This robbery netted the gang $700, which Al said was stolen just to pay expenses. But now the law was looking for them, in the person of Deputy U.S. Marshal Peyton Tolbert and Bud Ledbetter, who were not good men to have on your back trail. Both were experienced, smart, and tough as nails. Al became more ambitious. One night, he and his cohorts stopped a Santa Fe train near Edmond, just north of Oklahoma City. 3 members of the gang boarded the train at Ponca City, well to the north, and transferred to the tender when the train stopped for water at Edmond. The outlaws forced the crew to halt the train a little way down the road, and 4 more men came out of the darkness to join the first 3. The men began shooting and yelling, presumably to keep the train crew and passengers from interfering with the gang's onslaught against the express car. Bullets through the wall of the car forced the agents to open the door, and the gang entered to claim their bonanza. But things went sour fast. With the set screw apparently having been left behind or proven to be unsatisfactory, the gang tried dynamite. Not once but twice they blasted the Wells Fargo safe, but it refused to open. Defeated, the outlaws ordered the train crew to drive on, and then the outlaws disappeared. Once word of the raid made it to the marshals, posses hit the road from both Guthrie and Kingfisher. However, the posses came up empty-handed. Having failed at their first try at a train, the gang decided to try it again a couple of weeks later at a spot near Bond Switch, not far from Muskogee. This time, the gang stacked railroad ties on the tracks as a roadblock. The train arrived as scheduled, but the engineer, instead of jamming on the brakes, used the throttle instead, smashed through the barricade of ties, and disappeared into the night unrobbed. With the law on their trail, the gang decided to replenish their money supply by robbing the Santa Fe train depot at Purcell. This time they didn't even get started because a night watchman saw them skulking near the station. He promptly alerted the station agent, who called the city marshal, who showed up with a posse. Foiled again. Shortly afterward, the law learned that the gang intended to rob the bank in Minco. The outlaws again were thwarted, because a band of citizens mounted a 24-hour guard on the bank. The gang was getting hungry. So for the next raid, the gang chose the Rock Island, selecting a southbound train they thought was carrying some $90,000 in coin, headed for banks in Fort Worth. Al decided to rob the train in broad daylight, on the theory that the usual guards were only on duty at night. On the morning of October 1st, the gang, 6 men, forced a railroad section crew to stop the train. The gang hid themselves behind bandanas, except for Al, who had made himself a mask out of a bearskin saddle pocket and cut eye holes for visibility. This time Al had brought lots of dynamite, resolved that he was not to be stopped again by a strong safe. They laid their charge, lit the fuse, and waited for the money. The explosives went off with a colossal roar, tearing the express car to pieces, but the safe remained intact. Along the way, Al's grotesque mask slipped. Frustrated, the bandits laid another and even heavier charge, and the whole train shook, but the safe didn't. The gang was reduced to tearing open the registered mail and robbing the train crew and the passengers, more than 100 of them, of their cash and watches. Along the way, one of the outlaws shot off a piece of ear of a passenger who was slow to cooperate. This passenger was the only casualty. This unusual daylight robbery brought several posses converging on the probable escape route of the outlaws. The American Express Company and the Rock Island offered rewards, a total of $800 a head. A good deal of money in those days. But again, the gang got away and rendezvoused at a farm near El Reno. There they rested and split up their meager loot. Riding through the cold weather of late October, they moved east toward the town of Cushing. They invaded the home of merchant Lee Nutter, waking him, shoving a pistol in his face, and demanding that he go to his store at the front of the building and give them his money. But there wasn't any, because Nutter had sent his store's receipts on to the bank in Guthrie. So the gang had to make do with a couple of weapons and a measly $15, plus a selection of coats and such from the store's stocks, a jug of whiskey, and a bunch of bananas. Somewhere around Tulsa, Dynamite Dick and Little Dick West left the gang, presumably disgusted with all that work and danger and hardship for practically no reward. Dynamite Dick headed in the direction of Chakota, while West split and rode the other way. Early one morning, Dynamite Dick rode past two deputy marshals, Hess Busey and George Lawson, waiting in ambush. They offered him a chance to surrender, but he was wanted for more than the gang's amateurish crimes. There was a warrant for him for a murder committed back in his days with the Doolin gang. And so the outlaw whipped up his Winchester and fired. A return shot broke Dynamite Dick's arm and knocked him from the saddle, but he regained his feet and staggered into the brush, leaving his rifle behind him. The marshals followed, trading spatters of Dynamite Dick's blood. The marshals followed, trailing the spatters of Dynamite Dick's blood, and as night fell, they came on a cabin in the woods. They fired warning shots and announced they intended to burn the cabin to the ground. At this, an Indian woman and boy came out. The officers twice commanded them to set fire to the cabin, and on the second command, Dynamite Dick ran from the door, shooting as he came. The officers quickly put several holes in him, and he was dead within minutes. On November 29, the rest of the gang was holed up in a ranch house owned by a Mrs. Harless. After they had eaten supper, they were visited by a neighbor sent by the law to confirm the presence of the bandits. None of them saw the federal posse surrounding the house in the darkness. Deputy Marshals Peyton Tolbert and Bud Ledbetter were out there in the night with 5 other men, biding their time until the house grew dark and quiet. On the morning of November 30, Mrs. Harless's son appeared, walking out to fetch a bucket of water. He entered the barn and the officers snapped him up. The boy was missed around the family hearth, and soon Mrs. Harless herself appeared and went into the barn. Ledbetter collared her and explained the situation. They had a warrant for Jennings, said Ledbetter. He told her to go back inside and tell the outlaws that they were surrounded. Mrs. Harless delivered the message, and Ledbetter could hear sounds of argument from inside the house. Quickly, Mrs. Harless left the house, swathed in blankets against the cold. Jennings opened fire, but within a few minutes the outlaws realized it was time to flee, running out the back of the cabin, heading for an orchard, scrambling through the gunfire. They were lucky. One peace officer's rifle jammed at the first shot. The second got a charge of shot into Frank Jennings without appreciably slowing him down. All of the bandits had been hit, but none so crippled that he could not flee on foot. Al Jennings had been hit 3 times, including taking a bullet in his left thigh, but he could still move, and the bandits waded a creek and disappeared. Ledbetter was not happy when the officers lost the trail and could not pick it up again after a long search. The fleeing gang commandeered a wagon from 2 Indian boys, finally holing up at the ranch of Willis Brooks. The gang may have escaped, but they were in sad shape. Al and Pat O'Malley, at least, needed medical attention, and Brooks went into Chakota, ostensibly to find a doctor. Instead, he found Bud Ledbetter and told him where the gang was hiding. That night, Ledbetter, Tolbert, and 2 other lawmen set up an ambush in a ravine near the passing road. They dropped a tree across the road as a barricade and settled into the wait. They waited almost until the night. They waited almost. They waited most of the night until a wagon came. Al and O'Malley were bedded down on the back, and Frank was driving. Brooks had given them directions supposed to take them safely to Arkansas. In fact, he set them straight into Ledbetter's trap. There was no fight this time. Confronted by 4 rifles, the outlaws gave it up and were transported to the Muskogee jail, where Morris O'Malley already languished. Little Dick West was still free and still wanted. West had friends in the territory, so he could often find a safe place to hole up. Moreover, he had been long famous for wanting to sleep out of doors, whatever the weather, someplace out in the brush away from people. Enter Deputy Marshal Heck Thomas, who had kept order in the territory for long years and had killed Bill Doolin when the outlaw leader would not heed his order to surrender. If anybody could run West down, it would be Heck Thomas. West was working as a farmhand between Kingfisher and Guthrie, laboring for 2 different farmers. Local farmers spilled the beans in Guthrie, saying that Farmer Fitzgerald, hired hand, was trying to get them to commit a robbery with him. Such evil tidings quickly found their way to Thomas. While the hired man used an alias, Thomas guessed from his description that he was hearing about Little Dick West. Thomas led a 4-man posse, which included the formidable Bill Tillman, off to the Fitzgerald farm. Fitzgerald said he didn't know anything about the hired man, who, in any event, had long since left his employ. In Fitzgerald's barn, the lawmen found a horse matching the description of West's. The farmer said that he traded for the animal. Unconvinced, the posse rode off and got lucky, spotting a man scouting along the timber. Thomas and Tillman began to follow him, and the other 3 members of the posse rode on. Then they saw the same man standing by a farm shed. The man promptly stepped behind the barn and ran for it, and the 3 lawmen stepped into the open and ordered him to halt. It was West, and he kept running, snapping off several shots from his revolver. The lawmen responded with shotgun and rifle fire, and West was hit as he dived under the bottom strand of a barbed wire fence. He was dead before the posse could reach him. With his gang either killed or in the lockup, Al Jennings could start his second career, having been a notable flop at the first one. First, though, he had to go off to prison for a while. His sentence was reduced to only 5 years, and he received a presidential pardon. Jennings settled in Oklahoma City in 1911, went back to practicing law, set his sights on political office, and won nomination for County Attorney of Oklahoma County on the Democratic ticket. He lost in the general election, but 2 years later he ran for governor of all things, openly talking about his outlaw days. By then, his life on the Scout was commemorated not only by his 1913 book, Beating Back, but also by a film of the same title. Al even starred in the movie, which at least gave him great face recognition with the voters. It wasn't enough. The best Al could do was finish 3rd in a field of 6 in the Democratic primary. He gave up both politics and the practice of law and retired to sunny California, where he went to work making Western films. He died in Tarzana, California, the day after Christmas, 1961. It had been quite a life.